The toast was a violation. Prudence Lockhart stood near the back of the drawing room, a ghost in grey bombazine, and watched Mr. Osmond Fenwick raise his glass. His smile was a damp, polished thing, meant to charm and conceal. Lady Arabella Devereux, her aunt by a distant and unfortunate marriage, beamed at him, her face a mask of benevolent satisfaction. It was Prudence's 24th birthday, a fact no one had acknowledged, yet it was her future being toasted, as if it were a side of beef to be sold at market. "To a most promising arrangement," Fenwick declared, his eyes sliding towards Prudence for a fraction of a second. An arrangement. That was the word they used for the transaction that would see her married to this man to settle one of Lady Arabella's gambling debts. Prudence's hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, remained perfectly still. She did not clench them. She did not tremble. She had learned long ago that such displays were a currency she could not afford to spend. Her value in this house was her quiet efficiency, her ability to manage the accounts, mend the linens, and fade into the wallpaper. She was a cog in a machine that was slowly grinding her down, and cogs did not have feelings. Later that evening, long after the cloying scent of Fenwick's cologne had dissipated, Prudence sat in her small attic room. A single candle cast dancing shadows on the sloped ceiling. In her hands, she held her only true possession, a small, worn book of pressed flowers, its leather cover softened with age. Each brittle page held a memory of her mother, a primrose from a spring walk, a sprig of lavender from their tiny garden, a wild violet found by a stream. Her mother had taught her the names of every plant, their uses, their secrets. She had also taught her to be steady. "Dignity, Prudence," she used to say, her voice a warm whisper, "is a fortress no one can breach from the outside." Prudence traced the delicate, paper-thin form of a forget-me-not. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would endure this, as she had endured everything else since her parents' death had left her a penniless ward to the grudging charity of Lady Arabella. The world saw a plain, silent woman, a useful creature. No one saw the fortress, but the walls were beginning to feel very thin. The next morning, chaos erupted. A pipe in the main scullery had burst during the night, flooding the floor and ruining a week's worth of stored flour and sugar. The cook was shrieking, the maids were running in circles with useless rags, and Lady Arabella was developing a convenient migraine in her chambers. Prudence walked into the disaster. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and spoiled goods. She took one steadying breath. "Peg," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the noise. The young scullery maid, tears streaming down her face, froze. "Fetch Ned from the stables. Tell him to shut off the main water valve behind the kitchens. Now." The girl scurried off. "Tilly," she addressed another maid, "find every spare bucket we own. We will bail, not mop. Bess, clear the pantry shelves. We must see what can be salvaged." It was a litany of calm, practical instructions. She was not emotional. She was an equation, solving for order. She was on her knees, calculating the cost of the ruined supplies in a small notebook, when a long shadow fell over her. She looked up. A man stood in the doorway, tall and severe, his face a collection of harsh lines and shadowed planes. He was dressed in dark, perfectly cut clothes that seemed to absorb the light around him. She had never seen him before, but she knew him instantly. The hawk-like nose, the unnerving stillness. It was the Duke of Kestrel Chase, Lady Arabella's nephew, a man spoken of in whispers, a recluse, a widower, a man lost to grief. Gideon Devereux did not look at the frantic maids or the spreading pool of water. His gaze was fixed on her, on the neat columns of figures she was penciling into her notebook. The silence stretched, broken only by the drip, drip, drip from the ceiling. He had been standing there for some time, she realized, watching her. He had seen the panic, and he had seen her quiet command. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, held no pity. They held something else, something she could not name. It was not kindness. It was a sharp, focused attention, as if he were examining a peculiar specimen. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, devoid of pleasantry. "Who taught you to manage ledgers?" he asked. Not, "Who are you?" Not, "What has happened here?" but a direct, unnerving question that saw past the gray dress and the ruined scullery to the one thing she was good at. Prudence rose slowly to her feet, her notebook held protectively against her chest. "My father, Your Grace," she answered, her voice even. "He was a clerk." Gideon Devereux gave a single, sharp nod, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, Prudence felt a tremor of something unfamiliar. It was not hope. It was the terrifying, unwelcome sensation of being truly seen. The Duke's visit threw the household into a state of agitated servility. Lady Arabella emerged from her chambers, her migraine miraculously cured, and descended upon her nephew with a flurry of feigned affection and anxious chatter. Prudence retreated to her duties, expecting to be forgotten, a footnote to the day's domestic drama. She was, therefore, startled when she was summoned to the drawing-room that afternoon. The Duke stood by the window, his back to the room, a formidable silhouette against the gray light. Lady Arabella was perched on the edge of a chaise lounge, a predatory glint in her eye. Mr. Fenwick was there as well, looking displeased, his polished veneer slightly scuffed by the Duke's imposing presence. "Prudence, my dear," Lady Arabella began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that always set Prudence's teeth on edge. "His Grace has a most unusual proposition." Gideon Devereux turned. He did not waste time with preamble. "My estate is in disarray," he stated, his voice as stark as his posture. "I have been through 3 stewards in as many years. The household staff are insubordinate. The accounts are a disaster." He paused, his gaze settling on Prudence again, that same unnerving, analytical stare. "My aunt informs me you are capable." The word hung in the air, a plain and unvarnished thing, so different from the flowery compliments others used. "She suggests you might bring some order to Kestrel Chase," Lady Arabella chimed in. "A change of scenery, my dear, to help your cousin, a great honor." Prudence understood immediately. This was not an honor. It was an exile. Lady Arabella wanted her out of the way, to clear the path for Mr. Fenwick, but she wanted to do it under the guise of familial duty. She was to be shipped off to a failing estate with a rebellious staff, a task at which 3 professional men had already failed. It was a punishment, disguised as a promotion. Mr. Fenwick shifted, his displeasure clear. "Your Grace, surely a young woman is not suited to such a rigorous task. It requires a firm hand." The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. "It requires a clear head," he countered, his tone clipped. "I saw one of those in the scullery this morning. The hand can be taught." He turned his full attention back to Prudence, ignoring the others. "I will not ask you to work for free. I will pay you a salary. £30 per annum, plus room and board. Your title will be Household Comptroller. You will have full authority over the domestic staff and the household ledgers. The decision is yours." It was a fortune. More than that, it was a choice. A small, constrained choice, perhaps, but the first real one she had been offered in years. Stay here and be sold to Fenwick, or go to Kestrel Chase and face a different kind of ruin. She looked at Fenwick's smug face, at her aunt's false smile, and she thought of the fortress her mother had spoken of. This was not a breach. This was a gate, opening onto a dangerous and unknown country. But it was a way out. "I accept, Your Grace," she said, her voice betraying nothing of the turmoil within her. The Duke gave another of his curt nods. "You will be ready to leave in 2 days." He reached into his coat and produced a heavy iron ring holding 3 keys. He held it out to her. "These are for the study, the wine cellar, and the main ledger room. Do not lose them." As her fingers closed around the cold metal, a silent contract was sealed. He was not offering kindness or protection. He was offering a transaction, a problem to be solved. And as she looked at his closed-off face, she suspected he saw her in precisely the same way. The journey to Kestrel Chase was made in a stark, unadorned carriage, with the Duke sitting opposite her, wrapped in a silence as heavy as the brocade of his coat. He did not speak a single word for the entire 5-hour journey. Prudence did not attempt to break the silence. She watched the rolling hills give way to a wilder, more desolate landscape of moorland and granite tors. The air grew colder. Kestrel Chase appeared suddenly, a great, brooding mass of gray stone hunkered down against the wind. It was not a welcoming place. It was a fortress, like its master, built to keep the world out. There was no welcoming party. The great oak doors swung open to reveal a cavernous hall, thick with dust and the scent of cold ashes. A handful of servants were gathered, their faces sullen and unwelcoming. An older woman with iron-gray hair and a formidable bosom stepped forward. Her apron was clean, but her expression was hostile. "I am Hannah, the cook," she said, her voice flat. "The others are not worth your notice." It was a declaration of war. The Duke addressed them all without ceremony. "This is Miss Lockhart. She is the new household controller. Her instructions are to be followed as if they were my own. That is all." He then turned and strode away down a long corridor, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Prudence alone to face the hostile pack. She stood there for a moment, in the echoing silence, the ring of keys cold in her hand. The servants stared at her, their resentment a palpable force. They had broken 3 stewards. They clearly intended for her to be the 4th. She knew what they saw. A poor relation. A plain woman in a cheap dress. Another London fancy sent to torment them. They were loyal to the ghost that haunted this house, the late Duchess. Prudence would not win them with commands or threats. She would not try to win them with charm. She had only one weapon in her arsenal: competence. "My name is Prudence Lockhart," she said, her voice carrying in the vast space. "I would be grateful if you would tell me your names and your duties." One by one, grudgingly, they did. Peg, a scullery maid with frightened eyes. Nan, a housemaid who refused to meet her gaze. Ned, a young stable hand who had come inside, his face smudged with dirt. And Hannah, the cook, who watched her with an unblinking, challenging stare. That first week was a silent battle of wills. Prudence began by observing. She walked the cold, echoing halls, her footsteps the only sound. She noted the layers of dust on the furniture, the tarnished silver in the dining hall, the threadbare linen in the closets. The house was not just neglected, it was grieving. It was a mausoleum. She started not with orders, but with questions. She went to the kitchens, the heart of the house. Hannah stood before a cold hearth, arms crossed. "The last steward demanded a 10-course dinner for one every night," the cook said, her voice laced with contempt. "A waste of good food." Prudence looked at the empty larder shelves. "What would you prefer to cook?" she asked. Hannah blinked, taken aback by the simple question. "A decent stew," she grumbled after a moment. "Something to put warmth in a body." "Then please make a stew," Prudence said. "For all of us. And show me where the household account books are kept." The ledgers were a catastrophe, a tangle of unpaid bills, fraudulent entries from the disgraced stewards, and nonsensical orders. Prudence sat in the cold study for hours each day, her pen scratching, slowly unraveling the knots. She found a bill for 6 dozen bottles of French lace, an obvious forgery. She found another for a ton of sugar when the pantry was bare. She worked with a quiet, relentless focus, fueled by tea and the seed cake Hannah had started leaving on a tray outside the door. A small, unspoken truce. Her greatest discovery was the garden. Behind the house, choked with weeds and thorns, lay the ghost of a magnificent herb garden. Stone paths were buried, beds were overgrown, but the structure was still there. And amidst the chaos, a few hardy plants still survived. A tough old rosemary bush, a patch of stubborn mint, a single valiant lavender plant. Prudence felt a pang of recognition. This was her mother's world. She found a pair of old shears in a derelict potting shed and began to work, an hour each day after she finished the accounts. She cleared a small patch, her hands growing calloused. One afternoon, Ned, the stable boy, watched her from a distance. He was a boy of no more than 16, wary and silent. Finally, he approached. "That was her ladyship's," he said, nodding at the garden. "The Duchess. She loved it." Prudence looked at the boy's guarded face. "It's a good garden," she said simply. "It just needs a hand." The next day, she found a patch of ground near where she was working had been cleared, the weeds piled neatly to one side. Ned was nowhere in sight, but his work was unmistakable. It was the first act of voluntary help she had received. Slowly, tentatively, things began to change. The scent of beeswax replaced the smell of dust in the halls. The silver, polished by Peg under Prudence's patient instruction, began to gleam. Hot, savory meals appeared on the dining table. The house was beginning to breathe again. And the Duke watched. From his study window, he saw her in the garden, her gray dress smudged with dirt. He saw the ledgers on his desk, the red ink of debt being replaced by the black ink of solvency. He saw the servants, who no longer looked sullen, but watchful. He saw order emerging from chaos, not through force, but through a quiet, steady presence. He said nothing. But one evening, as she worked late in the study, he entered and placed a heavy woolen shawl over her shoulders. "The nights are cold," was all he said, before retreating back into the shadows. The wool was warm, and it smelled faintly of him, of old books and winter air. Prudence pulled it tighter, a fragile shield against the chill of the great, lonely house. The fragile peace of Kestrel Chase was shattered by the arrival of a gleaming black carriage. Mr. Osmond Fenwick stepped out, dressed in the height of London fashion, his smile as unwelcome as a winter frost. He had come, he announced, on business with the Duke, a matter of some shared investment. But his eyes, sharp and possessive, were on Prudence. He moved through the reviving house with a proprietary air, his presence a discordant note in the quiet harmony she had begun to build. "My dear Miss Lockhart," he said, cornering her in the hall, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. You have performed miracles here. But surely this rustic life is a trial for you. A woman of your sensitivities. He was testing her, reminding her of her supposed place. I find the work satisfying, Mr. Fenwick, she replied, her tone level. She made to move past him, but he blocked her way. Lady Arabella worries for you. She fears the Duke takes advantage of your good nature. The lie was delivered with a look of perfect sincerity. It was a warning shot. He was here to reclaim what he considered his. His visits became more frequent. He would praise her work to the Duke in a way that subtly undermined it, framing her competence as ambition. She has a remarkable head for figures, he'd say with a light laugh. One might almost mistake her for a man of business. He brought with him a former steward, a man named Pharaoh, whom the Duke had dismissed for incompetence, introducing him as an accounting expert to assist with the estate review. Prudence felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Pharaoh's eyes were shifty, and he watched her with a resentful glare. The servants closed ranks around her. Hannah would serve Fenwick lukewarm tea. Ned would mysteriously be unable to find a stable hand to see to his horse immediately. They were small acts of loyalty, silent declarations of allegiance, but Prudence knew they would not be enough. Fenwick was a snake, and he was coiling for a strike. The attack, when it came, was insidious. One morning, the Duke summoned her to his study. Gideon Devereux stood by the window, his expression colder and more distant than she had ever seen it. Mr. Fenwick and Pharaoh were there, standing by the large desk where the main estate ledger lay open. A sense of cold inevitability washed over Prudence. Mr. Fenwick has brought a discrepancy to my attention, the Duke said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He gestured to the ledger. Fenwick stepped forward, a look of sorrowful duty on his face. It is with the greatest reluctance, Your Grace, but it appears a sum of £200 is unaccounted for. The entry here, he pointed a manicured finger at a line of script, indicates a payment to a London creditor. A personal debt, it seems. Prudence looked at the entry. The handwriting was a skillful imitation of her own, but not perfect. The slant was slightly off, the loop on the L too flamboyant, and the debt itself was a fiction. This payment was made just last month, Fenwick continued, his voice resonating with false gravity. Paid from the estate's general fund. Pharaoh and I can find no corresponding receipt. He looked at Prudence, his eyes shining with triumph. Perhaps Miss Lockhart can explain it. All eyes were on her. She felt the weight of their suspicion, the cold finality of the trap closing around her. For one terrifying moment, she saw her future. Dismissed in disgrace, her reputation ruined, forced back under Lady Arabella's thumb and into the arms of this vile man. She looked at the Duke. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes unreadable. This was the test. She had brought his house back from the brink, balanced his books, earned the loyalty of his staff. But what was that worth against a line of ink in a book? She thought of her mother's words about the fortress of dignity. She would not weep. She would not plead. She would stand on the truth. That is a forgery, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Fenwick scoffed. My dear Miss Lockhart, a desperate claim. Prudence ignored him, keeping her eyes fixed on the Duke. She was speaking to him, and only to him. The handwriting is not mine, Your Grace, and I have no debts in London, or anywhere else. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but her hands, resting on the back of a chair, were perfectly steady. She had built her life here on a foundation of precision and honesty. Now she would see if that foundation would hold. Gideon Devereux's gaze remained on her, intense and searching. The air in the study was thick with tension. Fenwick looked from the Duke to Prudence, a smug certainty on his face. He believed he had won. He had presented tangible evidence, a damning entry in the Duke's own ledger, witnessed by a financial expert. Against that, what was the word of a penniless spinster? "A bold accusation, Miss Lockhart," the Duke said finally, his voice a low baritone that betrayed nothing. "You claim the entry is false. On what grounds, besides your word?" This was the precipice. He was not defending her. He was demanding proof. It was not the response she had hoped for, but it was the one she should have expected from a man who valued evidence above all else. A flicker of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced her composure. Had he already condemned her in his mind? "My system, Your Grace," she said, pulling herself back from the edge. Her voice was as controlled as ever. "For every expenditure over 5 shillings, I require a signed and dated receipt. Those receipts are filed and cross-referenced with my own private logbook, where I detail the purpose of each payment." She paused, letting the words sink in. "There will be no receipt for this £200 entry, because the transaction never occurred. And my logbook will show no record of it. The forgery is in this ledger only." Fenwick let out a short, dismissive laugh. "A convenient system. A private logbook no one has ever seen. How do we know you haven't simply destroyed the evidence?" Prudence met his sneer with a calm, unwavering stare. "Because my logbook and my receipt box are locked in my room. I will fetch them." The Duke held up a hand, stopping her. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Prudence's heart sank. It was over. He did not believe her. But then he turned his cold gaze on Fenwick. "This matter will be settled, but not here. Not now." His eyes seemed to bore into the other man. "I am hosting a small dinner party in 3 days' time. The Dowager Countess of Marley has already accepted her invitation. I will ask her to attend as a neutral observer. You, Mr. Fenwick, and you, Mr. Farrow, will attend as well. You will present your findings then. And you," he said, finally looking back at Prudence, "will present your defense. We will have this out in the open, with an impartial witness. A public trial. A humiliation staged over dinner." Prudence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. This was not a reprieve. It was a formal execution. Lady Arabella would be there, no doubt, relishing the spectacle. The Dowager Countess was known for her sharp tongue and sharper judgment. She would offer no mercy if Prudence could not prove her case. It was a gamble on a scale she could not comprehend. Gideon was either setting a stage for her utter ruin, or he was giving her a chance to fight with the weapons she had just named, her logs, her receipts, her impeccable order. She could not read his intent. His face was as closed and guarded as the day he had arrived. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. As she left the study, she could feel Fenwick's triumphant gaze on her back. He thought he was 3 days from victory. Prudence knew she was 3 days from fighting for her life. The next 2 days were the longest of Prudence's life. She performed her duties with meticulous care, her outward calm a stark contrast to the storm raging within her. The servants watched her with worried eyes. They knew something was wrong. Hannah pressed a warm scone into her hand one morning, her rough fingers lingering for a moment in a gesture of solidarity. "That Fenwick is a viper," the cook muttered. "We all see it." Ned left a small, perfect wild rose on the step of the potting shed for her. They were small comforts, but they bolstered her resolve. They believed in her. Their faith was a shield. On the evening of the dinner, Prudence dressed in her best gray gown, the one she had painstakingly mended herself. She wore no jewelry, no adornment. Her defense would rest on truth, not finery. When she descended the stairs, she saw the small assembly in the drawing room. Lady Arabella was there, dripping with jewels and malice. Mr. Fenwick stood beside her, confident and preening. And seated in the grandest armchair, observing everyone with piercing blue eyes, was the Dowager Countess of Marley, a formidable old woman whose opinion could make or break a reputation in the county. The Duke was a thundercloud in black evening wear, his face grim. He greeted Prudence with a stiff nod and led them into the dining room. The meal was a tense, unbearable affair. Fenwick directed the conversation, making subtle, cutting remarks about ambitious women and the untrustworthiness of employees. Lady Arabella seconded him with saccharine smiles and veiled warnings. Prudence ate little, her focus entirely on the reckoning to come. Finally, when the plates were cleared, the Duke spoke. "We have a matter of some seriousness to discuss," he said, his voice cutting through the strained pleasantries. He laid out the situation with stark, emotionless clarity. The discrepancy in the ledger, the accusation of theft, and Prudence's denial. He then gestured to Fenwick. "Mr. Fenwick, you will present your evidence." With a theatrical sigh of regret, Fenwick produced the estate ledger, opening it to the damning page. He explained the forged entry, the lack of a receipt, the clear implication of embezzlement. "It pains me to expose this," he concluded, looking at Prudence with false pity. "But my conscience and my duty to His Grace demanded it." The Dowager Countess peered at the ledger through her lorgnette. "The handwriting is quite neat," she commented dryly, her tone unreadable. "And now," the Duke said, turning to Prudence, "Miss Lockhart." All eyes swiveled to her. This was her moment. She stood and walked to a side table where she had placed a simple wooden box and a leather-bound logbook. "Your Grace, my lady," she began, her voice steady. "This is the logbook I keep for all household expenditures, and this box contains the corresponding receipts." She opened the logbook and the box. "You will find, my lady, that every entry in my book has a matching receipt in this box, and you will find that the fraudulent payment of £200 appears in neither." She passed the items to the Dowager Countess, who began to examine them with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Furthermore," Prudence continued, "while the forgery in the main ledger is skillful, it is not perfect. If you examine the capital letter P, you will see the forger uses a decorative flourish at the base. My own P is quite plain. It is a small detail, but a consistent one." A silence fell over the room as the Countess compared the ledger to Prudence's logbook. Fenwick began to look uneasy. "A clever fabrication," he blustered. "She could have prepared those books at any time." Just then, the dining room door opened. Hannah, the cook, stood there, her hands planted firmly on her hips. Behind her were Ned, Peg, and two other housemaids. They stood in silent, unwavering support. "Your Grace," Hannah said, her voice ringing with authority. "Permission to speak." The Duke nodded. "On the night Mr. Fenwick and that Farrow fellow discovered this error," Hannah declared, "I was unable to sleep. I saw a light in the study long after midnight. I saw Mr. Fenwick and Mr. Farrow in there, with the ledger. And I saw Mr. Fenwick with a pen in his hand." Fenwick's face went pale. "The word of a servant," he spluttered. But before he could continue, young Ned stepped forward, clutching something in his hand. "I found this, Your Grace," he said, his voice trembling slightly, but full of conviction. "In the rubbish pile behind the stables, near where Mr. Fenwick's horse was kept. He must have dropped it." He held out a crumpled piece of paper. The Duke took it and smoothed it out. On it, over and over, were practiced imitations of Prudence's signature, and dozens of practice capital P's, all with the telltale decorative flourish. The trap had snapped shut, but not on the person Fenwick had intended. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and public. A gasp went through the room. Lady Arabella looked as if she might faint. Mr. Fenwick stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The game was over. The Dowager Countess of Marley lowered her lorgnette and fixed Fenwick with a look of utter contempt. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "it seems the only thief in this room is the one who cries thief the loudest. You, sir, are a blackguard and a fool. Your reputation in this county is finished as of this moment." She then turned her gaze to Lady Arabella. "And you, madam, to conspire against your own ward for financial gain. It is beneath contempt. You will find your invitations to be scarce from now on." The public humiliation was complete. Fenwick, white-faced and trembling, turned and fled the room without another word. Lady Arabella, for once in her life, was speechless. She gathered the tattered remnants of her dignity and followed him, a disgraced queen abandoning her throne. The staff, standing in the doorway, did not move. Their expressions were grimly satisfied. They had not been commanded to speak. They had chosen to. They had chosen her. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The Dowager Countess rose. She walked over to Prudence and took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You, my dear, are a woman of substance and integrity. Do not let anyone ever tell you otherwise." She gave a pointed look at the Duke. "And you, Gideon, would do well to recognize the treasure you have in this house." With a final, regal nod, she took her leave. Prudence stood alone with the Duke in the grand dining room. The victory felt hollow, the relief overshadowed by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She had been vindicated, but she had been forced to fight for her very name in front of strangers. She looked at Gideon, waiting. He had remained silent throughout the denouement, his face an unreadable cipher. Had he known? Had this all been a test not just of her innocence, but of her strength? He walked towards her, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He stopped just before her, so close she could see the flicker of the candlelight reflected in his dark eyes. He did not apologize for his doubt. He did not offer platitudes. He did what he always did. He stated a plain truth. "They told me I was giving you a household no one could control," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. They were wrong. He slowly went down on one knee. It was not the gesture of a supplicant, but of a king humbling himself. It was an act of profound, shattering respect. He took her hand, his large, warm fingers enclosing hers. His gaze held hers, and for the first time, she saw past the walls he had built around himself. She saw the grief, the loneliness, but she also saw a fierce, unwavering certainty. "I was giving them a mistress they could choose," he continued, his voice quiet but resonant in the silent room. "As I choose you. Plainly, wholly. Will you be the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, Prudence Lockhart? Will you be my wife?" Tears she had refused to shed in fear and humiliation now welled in her eyes. Tears of disbelief, of overwhelming relief, of a joy so vast it felt like pain. She looked down at this powerful, broken man who saw her not as a servant, not as a convenience, but as his equal. She thought of the cold, silent house she had entered, and the home she had unknowingly started to build. She thought of the garden, waiting to be fully brought back to life. "Yes," she whispered, the single word holding the weight of her entire past and all of her future. "Yes." 1 year later, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Kestrel Chase. The gray stone of the house seemed to have softened, warmed from within. The halls, once silent and cold, now held the quiet hum of a happy, well-run home. Laughter could sometimes be heard from the kitchens, and the scent of baking bread and beeswax filled the air. Prudence, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, walked hand in hand with her husband through the herb garden. It was no longer a ghost of what it had been. It was a riot of life and color, meticulously tended and fragrant with rosemary, thyme, lavender, and a dozen other herbs. Bees droned lazily among the blossoms. Prudence's worn little book of pressed flowers now sat on the mantelpiece in their shared study, a treasured relic of the past that had led her here. Gideon stopped by a flourishing bed of chamomile. He reached into his coat and drew out a small, beautifully bound book. The cover was dark green leather, soft as butter, with no title. He handed it to her. Prudence opened it. The pages were thick, creamy, and completely empty. "For the flowers of Kestrel Chase," Gideon said, his voice holding the quiet warmth that she now knew so well. "For our future." She looked up at him, her heart swelling. He was no longer the cold, sealed man she had met in a flooded scullery. The harsh lines of his face had softened. He smiled more now, small, rare smiles that were reserved only for her. He had found his way back from the land of grief, guided by her steady, quiet competence, which he had come to see for what it was, a profound and abiding love. Hannah emerged from the house, carrying a silver tray with a teapot and 2 cups. She set it down on a small stone bench. "Your tea, Your Grace," she said, her address to Prudence now laced with deep, familial affection. She was no longer just the cook. She was a friend, a guardian, the gruff heart of their household. The staff had not just accepted Prudence, they cherished her. They were her staunchest allies, her fiercest protectors. They were her family, forged in a battle of loyalty and won through quiet dignity. Prudence poured the tea, the familiar ritual a small anchor in her new life. She handed a cup to Gideon. Their fingers brushed, a simple touch that still sent a jolt of warmth through her. He had chosen her, and she had chosen him, and together they had taken a cold, grieving house and filled it with life. They had built a fortress of their own, not of stone and silence, but of trust, respect, and a love as steady and enduring as the ancient rosemary bush that stood sentinel over their garden. Plainly, together. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The transformation of Kestrel Chase was not merely domestic. It had rippled out into the county. The initial whispers about the Duke's shocking marriage to his household controller had died down, replaced by a grudging respect and no small amount of awe. The Dowager Countess of Marley had made it her personal mission to ensure Prudence's acceptance, singing her praises at every tea and dinner, her sharp tongue defending the new Duchess against any lingering snobbery. "The girl has more sense and character in her little finger than the whole of the Fenwick family has in its entire lineage," she was fond of declaring, effectively silencing any dissent.
Lady Arabella Devereux and her shallow daughter Louisa had retreated to Bath in disgrace. Word had reached Prudence, through the Dowager Countess's extensive network of gossip, that Lady Arabella's credit had run dry, and her social standing had evaporated. Louisa had written a single, stilted letter of apology to Prudence, full of self-pity, but containing a sliver of genuine regret. Prudence had not replied, but she felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness for a life wasted on envy and greed. Forgiveness was not necessary. She simply let the past go, like a boat pushed out to a distant sea. Her days were full, not with the frantic, invisible labor of her past life, but with meaningful purpose. She still oversaw the household accounts, her ledgers now a model of clarity and prosperity, but she also spent hours with the head gardener, planning new additions to the estate, her knowledge of botany proving invaluable. She established a small school for the children of the tenant farmers in a disused cottage on the estate grounds, teaching them to read and write herself 2 afternoons a week. The children, at first shy and wary of the great lady, had come to adore her for her patience and kindness. They would bring her small bouquets of wildflowers, which she would carefully press between the pages of her new green book. Gideon had watched this all with a quiet, profound pride. He had married her for her integrity and her competence, for the order she brought to his chaotic world. He had not anticipated the sheer depth of her compassion, the way she would not only manage his home, but heal it, and in doing so, heal him. One afternoon, he came to find her in the new schoolhouse. She was sitting with a small girl, patiently guiding her hand as she formed the letters of her name. The room was filled with the murmur of children's voices and the smell of chalk dust and old wood. He leaned against the doorframe, content to watch. He remembered the first time he had seen her, on her knees in the flooded scullery, a small, still point in a vortex of chaos. He had been drawn not to her beauty, the world was full of beautiful women, but to her stillness, her absolute self-possession in the face of disaster. It was a quality he, a man drowning in his own internal chaos, had recognized as priceless. He had been numb for so long after his first wife's death, moving through his life like a ghost in his own home. Prudence had not banished the ghost of his past. Instead, she had made peace with it. She had reverently cleaned and preserved the late Duchess's rooms, and she spoke of her with respect, creating a space where Gideon's memories could rest without causing him pain. She had not replaced his past. She had built a future alongside it. When the last child had been collected by their mother, Prudence looked up and saw him. A slow smile lit her face, a genuine, unguarded smile he had come to treasure above all things. "You are quiet today," she said as she packed away the slates. "I was thinking," he replied, walking towards her. He took the stack of slates from her hands and placed them on the table. "I was thinking about the day I gave you the keys." "I remember," she said softly. "I thought you were sentencing me to a penal colony." He allowed himself a small, wry smile. "In a way, I was. I was testing you. I thought if you could bring order to this house, you were a miracle worker. I did not expect you to bring it life." He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "The greatest change at Kestrel Chase was not in the accounts, or the polishing of the silver, or even the revival of the garden. It was in me." It was the most he had ever spoken of his own transformation, and the plain-spoken admission was more moving to her than any flowery poetry. She leaned into his touch, her fortress of dignity now a sanctuary of shared love. "The house was just waiting, Gideon," she whispered. "It was waiting for its master to come home." "And I," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur as he leaned in to kiss her,
was waiting for you. The kiss was gentle, familiar, a reaffirmation of the quiet, unshakable bond between them. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other not a savior, but a partner, an equal, a home. As they walked back to the great house, silhouetted against the setting sun, the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. Kestrel Chase stood waiting, its windows aglow with warm light, a beacon of order and love in the vast, wild landscape. It was no longer a fortress against the world, but a world unto itself, built on the steady foundation of a woman who had been seen for who she truly was, and a man who had been brave enough to choose her. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.